In any given point in time, there are usually some pretty great games that exist. Though they may be a minority, there is rarely any isolated point in time in which there are no fun games, no games to look forward to playing, no games that impress and push the boundaries in the game development space. But something a lot less common is a game that goes beyond that.
Sweet land of liberty.
Games that seem so impressive, so cool of a concept, so elevating of an idea that they just grab your full attention and hold it. It's a once-in-a-blue moon event, something that seems almost too good to be true, a real piece of innovation in the gaming space, something that does what no title before it has been able to do in a fashion no title seems to be able to replicate. It's genre-defining, and on today's Blue Moon, there lies Hyperlight Breaker. Now I know, this is a daunting title to put on any game, let alone one you've probably never heard of. But I really think this game deserves its title. It's one that I've been looking forward to for well over a year now, and one that now having played, has met and exceeded my expectations for it. Not only providing one of the best roguelike experiences I've had to date, but goes so far in innovation in its space that I genuinely believe it is the sole leader of its own unique genre. So enough with the foreplay. Let me tell you about why Hyperlight Breaker is so good, it's genre defining. Quick disclaimer, this video is sponsored by Arc Games, the publisher of Hyperlight Breaker. However, I was given total creative freedom to make this video, and the fact that I'm sponsored has not clouded my judgments. However, I still wanted to make it known for the sake of fairness. Hyperlight Breaker is the sequel to Hyperlight Drifter, a well-renowned dungeon crawler made by the same studio as Breaker. Breaker takes place decades before the events of Drifter, and follows you, a Breaker, fitted with the task of restoring order to a world long tarnished by a devastating war. I've actually not ever played Drifter, and as such, I don't have much knowledge on how the two games tie into each other, so this review will come from a place of total naivety in terms of the world of Hyperlight. But I think that on its own, Hyperlight Breaker provides a very full experience in terms of understanding what's happening. I don't feel like I'm missing many pieces of the puzzle in terms of story, and that's actually a massive plus for me for the game. Anyway, the primary gameplay follows you exploring the Overgrowth, a procedurally generated open world under full control of the Abyss King, a mysterious, elusive tyrant holding full power over this world, who serves as the main antagonist of the game. Once spawned in, you'll be looting the Overgrowth's vast resources, collecting prisms, and taking down the Crowns, the powerful bosses guarding the Abyss King and overseeing the Overgrowth, climaxing in a final bout with the king to take him down. On the surface, it may not seem so impressive, but under the hood, this game packs some real firepower. The first and most impressive aspect to me is the world. The game has a heavy emphasis on exploration, and facilitates this through an impressively large map that is entirely procedurally generated on each run. The Overgrowth's structural landscape does have a finite number of variations, but I've already seen 8 with just 7 hours of gameplay, and that's the only real constant here. The contents of the world itself are much more truly random, with full randomness in the placement of structures, loot, and enemies. Enough so that the world genuinely feels totally anew on every run I've had so far, providing a fresh new take on the Overgrowth with each iteration. And the world that is generated is a perfect balance of large enough to encourage exploration and give ample means to do so, but small enough that most locales have content in them and meaning to exploration. This is a pretty important balance to strike, as you don't want a world to be big and empty. The size needs to be justified such that traversing it yields some value, which Breaker does a great job of doing through its large coverage of densely populated areas with lots of loot to scavenge and enemies to take on, all while still being a pretty sizable map. I mean, it would take like well over 15 minutes just to sprint from corner to corner on every variation I've seen so far on estimates. And all of that is randomly generated on every run. Like, geez. I don't want to hang on it too long, but I really can't understate how impressed I was with how the devs managed to get such a well-crafted world be not only consistently well-crafted, expansive, and densely populated, but also do so while being constantly randomized. It's really a pinnacle of procedural generation. Of course, the world does more than just look pretty. It contains a trough of items, shrines, architecture, enemies, etc. The main points of interest on the map are the various lootable objects like containers, metagems, and corpses that garner equipment and resources, the 6 collectible prisms guarded by powerful enemies, the 2 crown bosses to take down after collecting all 6 prisms, the Abyss King, the various scattered enemies in the landscape, and the exit teleporter. To tackle these challenges, you're equipped with an arsenal of a ranged weapon, melee weapon, active ability, passive ability, character abilities, and movement mechanics. The main, or at least my main, source of damage lies in the various melee weapons, of which there are an ample amount with a variety of different playstyles and effects. Each has a distinct feel, from the heavy-hitting Vector Hammer to the quicker Solar Bolters to the range capabilities of the Giant's Touch. And each has its own unique ability on a slight cooldown, from slashing the ground up with a zero edge to increasing attack and movement speed while wielding the Bloody Pillar to shooting a burning crossblade forward with the Soldier's Lights. These melee weapons are coupled with your gun, functioning as your ranged option. The guns, as the melee, vary in appliance and strength, from the hard-hitting close-range shotgun to the accurate longer-range railgun, and each has its own place in terms of kitting your builds. You also have a multitude of actives and passes at your disposal to further supplement combats, in the form of amps and holobites, which provide a variety of supports from extra damage to healing to gun and melee boost to dropping the cube. Additionally, you also have your movement and defensive mechanics in the form of dashing, hoverboarding, and parrying. The dash functions as you'd expect, giving a burst of movement in iframes, and can be comboed with weapons via animation canceling to dodge in and out of combat as needed. You also have a more dangerous but rewarding parry option, which, when timed correctly, allows you to negate hit damage and briefly stun opponents, as well as gain a slight bit of health back with a perfectly timed block. This, of course, comes at the cost of necessitating close timing, as the window of parrying is much smaller than the more generous iframes and dashing, providing a really fun structure of balancing your dashes and parrying to best suit your scenario, taking risks or playing more defensively, and generally just giving you more combat options, which is always a plus. And of course, you have quicker methods of travel in the form of your hoverboard and glider, which act as assistants in your exploration of the overgrowth and really give a nice sense of the large scope of the game. All these combat aspects coagulate into a very fluid combat experience, encouraging thoughtful fighting and kit building and rewarding you with smooth and satisfying gameplay. The controls handle really well. There's a lot of satisfying moments when you really get into a groove. The only real inhibition is your reaction time and strategic abilities, and overall, it just feels good to fight. Of course, you'd expect that from a combat-centric game, but at the same time, it is rarely a given in games nowadays, and luckily in this case, it is in fact a given. The variety of weaponry leads to many different build options on every run. The movement options give you plenty of opportunity to control the field in battle. The balancing of all the equipment is great, each part of combat plays into the other well and creates combat that is enjoyable, and removes any sense of monotony that might come from repeated exploration of the overgrowth in an isolated run. Considering the game's heavy emphasis on exploration, having a satisfying combat system to facilitate exploration is critical, and it's a large chunk of the reason that exploration becomes an inherent piece of the game's architecture. You're encouraged by the seamlessness of the combat to engage in more exploration to fight more enemies and gather more materials, making any sense of monotony from traversing the overgrowth lessened through the constant dopamine in combats. The difficulty is also right about where it should be. I certainly have never not struggled in a run, but most of my deaths feel like they are a fair result of either me being too greedy and going for too much, a simple skill issue, or a misbuilding of my kit. And the difficulty increase over time mechanic in the form of enemy spawns or radioactive hazards that periodically occur in increasing larger amounts over time provide ample challenge and encourage precise and concise movements, as loitering too long can cost you dearly. I love this mechanic in Risk of Rain 2, and it's nice to see a version of it here. A sense of urgency moves along gameplay and keeps things from becoming stagnant even if you were to hypothetically clear the map, which is an extreme example, but you get the point. Having such a massive world comes with the slight inherent downside of a sense of meaningless ease, being able to coop up somewhere and hide out if things get out of hand. So having ramping difficulty over time provides that necessary sense of urgency and challenge that constantly keeps you on your toes. It makes the experience of the overgrowth really feel all that more aggressive as the game intends thematically. Exploring and fighting have really never felt better in a game. Combining the fact that exploring often yields a lot of game-changing loot and the fact that combat is so fun, exploring rarely if ever feels like a chore, because it is necessary to gather loot and collect prisms, but also because it's never tedious to get into a fight. It's fun to just free roam from corpse to prism to chest and plow through enemies on the way. In fact, I've often divulged paths just to take out a gathering of enemies, even if it's out of the way of the next prism I'm headed to. And the procedural generation aspect ensures that the places and routes you take never feel repetitive, making exploration more consistently enjoyable since you've got a whole new overgrowth to explore on every run. This is where I think Breaker really cements itself, creating a sort of endless adventure with unlimited exploration potential due to its roguelike status backed up by a very solid system of combats and gameplay to make said exploration fun and worthwhile. It's a large reason I gave Breaker the title-creating name that I did, as there are few other games that accomplish this feat of exploration mixed with worthwhile combat in the roguelike genre in the way that Breaker does. And I'm honestly surprised not many others have tried something like this before. It just works so well and is so benign of a concept. Want more exploration in the exploration genre? Add in the roguelike aspect of procedural generation with a solid gameplay base, and boom, insane amounts of exploration compacted into a traversable map. Anyway, I digress. The combat and exploration is very solid, and the mechanic of being able to use the exit teleporter at any time to return to base with all of your loot makes for a really fun mind game of deciding when you've gotten enough loot to warrant heading back. You can be more greedy and try to clear out a majority of the prisms to be able to focus on bosses upon your return and grab up all the loot as you go. Or play it safe and return only after a few minutes of exploration to avoid an early death. You're allowed 4 deaths before the entire world is reset, so you have to think carefully about when to return and when to stay, as teleport returning will let you keep everything you've collected in a run, but dying will let you keep only your consumable resources. All the equipment in the game, which I will get to, has a sort of health system like you do, with equipment taking damage upon your death. If something takes too much damage, equipment can break and be completely lost and unusable in future runs, which can be detrimental if the equipment in question is a high level and rarity, really adding meaning to death beyond it costing one of your limited lives. It's nothing huge, but the teleporter is a nice way to give you options on how you want to approach the overgrowth, give you control on when to leave and when to stay, which I would much prefer over just mindless fighting until death, as it adds some strategy to how you navigate the overgrowth. I'm a big proponent of putting as much in the player's control as possible when it comes to game mechanics, as it adds more for us to use in strategizing and gives less of a sense of any handholding, so while it's not a huge deal, it's something I really appreciate as a concept. Should you succumb to the overgrowth or leave in one piece, you return to the Cursed Outpost, a hub world where you can purchase various upgrades, equipment, and gear. In runs, you collect a variety of different resources which act as currency for different things in the hub. You can visit Ferris Bit to get permanent EXE slots, which buff your character through purchasable skill tree perks. You can also visit the gun, melee, or active and passive shops to purchase their respective wares to supplement your combat when overgrowth loot isn't cutting it or perishes with your death. You can also unlock and upgrade the abilities of these 3 currently available breakers, unlock and upgrade the stats of their different psychoms, which are basically just your core stats like health and damage, and increase affinity with the shopkeepers to gain discounts and extra rewards, utilizing abyss stones, cores, golden rations, bright blood, and chips, which you gain from defeating the crowns, opening more chests, and progressing further into and exploring the overgrowth respectively. At no point in the game are you drained of all your equipment. Even on reset, all that resets is the overgrowth in your perishable resources. So there's a lot of influential permanent progression to be had in the hub world, which is great since it gives a sense of progression and adds more meaning to deep exploration of the overgrowth on every run of it. Slowly amassing an arsenal of weaponry and more permanent upgrades for the breakers, still however diluted by the fact that equipment can expire if you die holding it, creating a good balance of equipment stockpile potential along with allowing the roguelike permadeath aspect to still take hold and force some form of resetting. I was really impressed at just the vast amount of gear and upgrades that exist even in early access, with a pretty full skill tree, dozens of melee weapons, guns, passes, and actives, and a slew of stats, aspects, and buffs to permanently upgrade. Plenty enough that I have yet to try and upgrade and use everything, even with the 7 hours I have in game so far. I think having something to work towards is critical in a roguelike, as it cements some form of progress in the permadeath setting the game has and allows for a feeling of progression, which is important as a motive driver to make players want to keep running loops of the game. At the same time, I also like that it isn't critical that you have every single permanent upgrade to get through a cycle. I haven't beaten the Abyss King yet, but I haven't had a lot of time to play and have had my progress reset due to a game update, and yet I still got through the first 2 prison boss on my second run of my new save file. The equipment merchants have a similar loop of random weaponry and passes and actives to give regardless of run progress, which levels the playing field and removes any feeling of needing to grind to get through the crowns in the Abyss King. I'm sure a very talented and lucky player could theoretically get through everything on their first run or 2, or at the very least it felt like it when playing through the game. All of this also lends to that exploration emphasis in the game. Having so many different things to collect means that thorough exploration is rewarded. You can't just breeze through the overgrowth and expect to get everything you need. The many different resources of the game are acquired in different ways. Defeating enemies for bright blood, opening scattered chests and containers for chips and cores, finding scattered metagems on the ground to make medkits, etc. It's rewarded to take deep dives into the nooks and crannies of the overgrowth, and there's not so much stuff you need to collect that it's overwhelming, but it's enough to encourage the player to really look around when exploring the overgrowth. You could be just a couple chips shy of that fancy new vector hammer you saw in the melee shop after all. And speaking of hammers, I really liked the equipment the game provides. Most all of the weapons, passives, actives, abilities, and aspects are pretty unique, provide a variety of boosts, and can be combined in different ways to create an optimal build for whatever type of kit you're going for. Each part can tie into each other to support the other's weaknesses, giving every run a new strategy controlled by you and influenced by what you can find in the overgrowth and what's available at the shops. Every single piece of equipment in the game, aside from permanent buffs, are tiered, with higher tier loot containing more beneficial modifiers and lasting for more deaths, giving a nice randomness to equipment and further emphasizing exploration in the overgrowth, which can potentially be holding some incredibly high rarity loot, as well as constant return to shops which rotate their loot every couple cycles, with high potential to get a great weapon on sale, so long as you collected enough resources in the run for it. Non-tangentially related to what I've been talking about so far, but one really notable point I wanted to cover about the game was the story and atmosphere it presents. The environment of the Overgrowth plays heavily into a sense of dread, a destroyed world laid to waste, with greenery overtaking any structure left standing, and riddled with debris, natural growth, and just a sense of abandonment. Even randomly generated, the world conveys a sense of desolateness, with its inhabitants under the control of the Abyss King, mindlessly attacking you almost perceptibly against their will. The more intelligent, or more put-together crowns even seem to be in some state of disarray, especially seen with Dro, all culminating in this novel told exclusively through gameplay and exploration, spinning a tale of a once flourishing world now decrypted by an evil and selfish tyrant, of whom life is not but to be puppeted under his domain. There's also various pieces of story that can be unlocked for the existing crowns, giving way to more backstory for them in the greater world to help fill in the pieces of story that the environment doesn't. I personally love themes of ancient ruined worlds, ravished by something so long past its events are just a memory, left to be decoded by the players in the aftermath in a way that doesn't quite have a right answer, giving way to many theories and ideas that can be proposed and evidenced by the more vague puzzle pieces the game presents you. As opposed to direct verbal or sequential telling of the story, the game instead offers bits and pieces for you to interpret through exploration, which makes for some fun lore creation for the community to gather around, and further influences the necessity of exploration. I'm sure there's a lot that also ties into Drifter, though I'm entirely unaware of it having not played it before. And I actually take that fact as a positive, since it means that even coming fresh with no knowledge of the prior game, it's still very possible to get enveloped in the atmosphere and story of the game. While those who know of Drifter may see further into the world of Hyperlight and how this game may fill some of the gaps of the events of Drifter and vice versa. I'll admit I'm not the biggest lore nut. I usually rely on others to summarize the many things I miss in a game so I can interpret them. But I do appreciate the thought that went into the world of the Overgrowth, and am impressed that even with procedural generation, they managed to make a pretty cohesive story that is pretty intriguing to explore and discover. I remember first coming out from the starting lower dungeon and just taking a moment to take it all in. The structures, the plants, the sky, the landscape, and the music. My gosh, the music really leans into that unknown, mysterious, slightly hostile feel the game contains. And it flows so well with your current state too, shifting seamlessly from more aggressive in combat to calmer while traversing to climactic in crown battles, all while remaining distinct and unique in different tracks. Big kudos to Joel and Trope, the composers of the game's music. Y'all did a great job and really helped the game feel like it's taking place in the Overgrowth. Hyperlight Breaker is by no means a perfect game. It could really use an actual step-by-step tutorial. The performance kinda tanked at times even with my decently average PC. The map, while impressive, could use some adjustments to give its locales more reason to explore after a couple returns from the teleporter. But considering it's just in early access, I am really excited to see where it goes once it's fully developed. Heart Machine have really laid the foundation for an incredibly fun and unique title. So much so, it's warranting of its own genre, or at least being in the spearheads for it. And while it's certainly far from the course that Drifter took, I think Heart Machine has a gem of a game here, incorporating the roguelike aspects to procedural generation and permadeath, along with an emphasis on open-world exploration, coupled with smooth, polished, and engaging gameplay to create an experience that can hook players for hours, and provide an incredibly fun and unique experience run after run, with its roguelike and exploration elements combining and enhancing each other into something I have not quite seen in my gaming experience to date. I implore y'all to go try out the game on Steam. It's live right now in early access, and I've got a link in the description. I think if you like open world type stuff like Breath of the Wild or roguelikes or both, you're really gonna love it. Also, big shout out to Arch Games for reaching out to me to partner for a sponsorship. If I had to pick any game to make a sponsorship video for, this is definitely in the tops of my list, and I'm excited to see what you guys can accomplish in the full release of Breaker. But what do you all think? Go try out the early access and tell me, is Breaker truly the genre-defining gem I claim it to be? Does it lack below or above what I put forward for it in this video? And what were your thoughts on the game? Let me know in the comments, drop a sub if you'd like, another big thank you to Arc Games and Heart Machine, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye.